Today I'll be presenting some research that I'm conducting with Dr. Bruce Grayson on various types of support that NDErs may need after their experience in order to process it. And I'm very grateful and honored to be presenting this research at IANS. And also I'm very honored to be working with Bruce on this research of potentially great practical importance to NDErs. So a lot of times when we talk about what happens after an NDE or the after effects of an NDE, there's a lot of focus in the discussion on the positive aspects, including positive after effects such as increased appreciation of life, increased self-esteem, increased compassion for other people, a great desire to serve other people, less interest in materialistic pursuits, and an almost complete loss of fear of death. And these are all great things, but it seems that there's less of a focus on the difficulties that some NDErs may face, such as challenges of integrating the experience or difficulty to talk about the experience with loved ones and medical professionals for fear of rejection and ridicule. And unfortunately, there's also still limited specialized help for NDErs. So in this study, we specifically wanted to get the perspective of NDErs on their needs after the experience and what type of support they have sought out, whether it was helpful, how they benefited from it, and specifically if there are any barriers that prevented NDErs from seeking support. I also want to clarify that during this talk, I'll be using the terms support and help interchangeably, but even though we say help, we don't in any way mean to pathologize some of the normal experiences that people have after an NDE. We have a second arm of this study, which is specifically with professionals and counselors who have worked with NDErs in addressing their therapeutic needs and helping them process the NDE. So today I'll present data from both arms of the study, but I will mostly focus on NDErs. I will be showing graphs with numbers, but I'll also share some direct quotes from NDErs that help to illustrate some of the points that I'm making with data. So I'll start with a few quotes that touch on some of these more difficult aspects of the experience. So one of our NDErs said, NDErs struggling to cope and function because of NDE-related mental health issues, a lack of societal understanding and appropriate care is a serious worldwide problem that seems to be invisible to most. Another NDEr said, I just feel awake to reality, but alone in that knowledge. And yet another example, I'm not comfortable in this world. Things that consume other people are foreign to me. I have no common threads with most people, yet I get along with others extremely well. I just feel like an outsider looking in. And another experiencer who had their experience a long time ago said, there were no therapists aware of NDEs 39 years ago. They locked people up in mental wards back then if anyone spoke of such things. I want to think that we've come a long way since then, but there's still a lot to be done to bring awareness to NDEs outside of this narrow setting of IANS in this particular conference. So our study of NDErs about help and support they needed consisted of an online questionnaire that NDErs completed at their leisure at home. We recruited NDErs in several different ways. The bulk of our participants were recruited through IANS, and we also recruited through Facebook groups, ND Facebook groups, or our own Facebook page, and also from the pool of individuals who contact us to tell us about their experience. And I want to specifically thank anyone in the audience here today who may have participated in our study. We're deeply grateful for this important contribution you're making to this research. So in the end, our final sample of NDErs consisted of 167 NDErs, most of them, well, more females than males. The average age at the NDE was 30 years of age, and the average age at which people filled out the survey was 53 years old. Although we had a very wide range from 18 all the way up to 82 years old for completing the survey. And our sample is very diverse with respect to occupation and education, but unfortunately a little bit less diverse with respect to ethnicity. So we gave them a long questionnaire and asked many questions, including about people's backgrounds, the content of their NDE, the circumstances in which it occurred. We asked about how people changed after the NDE and specifically with whom they've communicated about the NDE. And also importantly, we also asked about the support and help they've sought out, any difficulties they experience after the NDE, any reasons not to seek support. And we also used Dr. Grayson's NDE scale to assess the depth of the NDE and also as a research criterion to determine if an NDE, an experience qualified as an NDE. So the NDE scale quantifies the intensity of the number of typical NDE features, such as perhaps having an out-of-body experience or encountering spirits of deceased relatives or mystical beings, or having an overwhelming sense of peace. So let's dive straight into the data. The first noteworthy piece of data I want to show you has to do with how experiencers feel about communicating about the NDE. So we asked them whether they felt the need to talk about the NDE, and we also asked NDErs if they were afraid to talk about the NDE. So a majority of experiencers, 85%, said that they felt a need to talk about the NDE, but more than half were afraid to talk about it. So I want to share some direct quotes from NDErs that illustrate this interplay between wanting and needing to talk about the NDE and also being afraid or hesitant to do so. One NDEr said, "I did not talk about my experience to many people at all because I thought they would think I was crazy. Then I felt bad because I feel I should be telling everyone so they do not fear death. So they do not need to fear death. It's a double-edged sword." Another experiencer wrote, "Even now, it's clearly the biggest thing that has ever happened to me, yet I'm also aware that very few people want to hear about it, so I quietly look for validation on my own." And the last quote I want to share here is, "Speaking about these experiences / encounters to people who do not appreciate that dimension feels not right." So we specifically asked experiencers what problems may lead them to seek help. And we summarized difficulties that NDErs may face in several different categories. 54% of NDErs reported at least one of these difficulties. The most commonly endorsed category of difficulties have to do with some after effect of the NDE. And that was endorsed by a quarter of our NDErs. In this category, respondents listed struggling with unusual or paranormal abilities, such as having precognitive visions or dreams, being able to tell when people would die, communicating with spirits, or experiencing greatly increased sensitivity and empathy towards other people, which some NDErs actually struggled with. And some NDErs also reported struggling with symptoms of depression and post-traumatic stress disorder associated with the experience. To a lesser extent, NDErs reported struggling with something in the NDE itself. Most answers in that category centered around trying to understand the experience or searching for answers about what happened during the experience. One experiencer wrote that she sought help hoping that I could live up to the expectations and promises I had made God if He allowed me to come back and raise my kids. Experiencers also reported seeking help for some problem with other people as a result of the NDE. And in this category, experiencers included issues stemming from other people who may not understand the experience or the changes that the NDEer went through after the experience. Here's a few quotes here. One NDEr wrote, "A lot of people just don't get the bigger picture, and having friendships are difficult to establish." And another wrote, "It completely changed my worldview and left me with a knowing about life and death. I needed to find validation since I quickly found out that most people do not take something like this seriously. I quickly found that if someone has not had a similar experience, they will have no idea what you are talking about. I felt like a crazy person trying to explain what must have sounded bizarre." And about 10% of experiencers reported seeking help for something related to the physical condition or event that led to the NDE. And finally, we also included an open-ended category of seeking help for something else related to the NDE, which was endorsed by 13% of respondents. Experiencers wrote about a variety of difficulties that compelled them to seek help. And within that category, examples include seeking help in accessing the content of the NDE, or struggling with a desire to go back home to the realm experienced during the NDE, or struggling to find a purpose after the NDE. One NDEr wrote, "Having a feeling I'm supposed to do something but not know what. I feel lost. Sometimes I wish I could have stayed where I was. I also feel the heavy burden when I do something I know I shouldn't, and I feel worse because I know better," if that makes sense. So the next piece of data I want to show you has to do with the reasons that experiencers do not seek help or support. So we talked about some issues and difficulties faced by NDErs, but it's also important to recognize that some experiencers simply do not feel the need to seek support in processing their NDE or any difficulties resulting from it. So in our sample of NDErs, 22% stated that they felt no need to seek support. And on average, these experiencers had had slightly less deep NDEs. So I've grouped the remaining reasons for not seeking support thematically rather than by frequency. First, there are what I call practical or logistical reasons for not seeking support. One of the most commonly endorsed reasons was that experiencers did not think that such help was available, which was endorsed by 27% of NDErs. And other practical reasons for not seeking help include not being able to find appropriate help, which was endorsed by 18% of NDErs, and also not being able to afford it, which was endorsed by almost 13% of experiencers. The next category of reasons for not seeking support include more emotional or psychological reasons. So fear of being thought crazy and fear of not being believed were each endorsed by more than a quarter of NDErs. And more than 17% of NDErs also endorsed fear of being ridiculed as a reason to not seek help. And some respondents also stated that they didn't want to or couldn't talk about the experience as a reason to not seek support. And interestingly, these NDErs had experienced on average deeper NDEs. And finally, we also included an open-ended category of reasons for not seeking support with processing the NDE. I'll include a few quotes from experiencers here. So one NDEr wrote, After a few attempts, I honestly didn't feel anyone was deep enough to handle it. I know that sounds egotistical, but it seemed like all the responses were textbook and uninspired. Very disappointing. Yet another NDEr wrote, I tried to get a lot of help and no one was able to talk to me. Some said, I'll call you back and didn't, and one church said, we don't do that here. And yet another example, my experience felt that those around me didn't understand the magnitude of what I went through, so I didn't think others would care either. So overall, many of the answers in this category were suggestive of either perceptions or experiences of inadequacy or unavailability of support for NDErs. Next, we asked NDErs where they turned for help in addressing any difficulties they faced after the NDE. So 63% of all NDErs in our sample reported seeking some kind of support. Among these experiencers who sought support, more than half, 58%, turned to a mental health professional, which includes therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and counselors. The other categories of helpers were endorsed by fewer experiencers. About a quarter, or exactly a quarter of experiencers reported that they turned to a spiritual counselor. So within that broad category, NDErs included psychics, shamans, or various spiritual or other types of spiritual counselors. And the next three categories of helpers were endorsed at about the same rate. So at 19% frequency, NDErs reported turning to an online resource, which would include message boards or Facebook groups and other ways that experiencers could connect with other NDErs. And also at 19% of endorsement, NDErs reported turning to a religious professional, which would include clergy people, chaplains, and religious counselors. And 18% of NDErs who sought help turned to some kind of organization, such as IANS and ASSIST, the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences. And finally, 15% of NDErs who sought help turned to some other health professionals like a nurse or a physician other than a psychiatrist. So how was the support or intervention NDErs received helpful or beneficial? We provided specific categories for respondents to choose from, as well as open-ended answers, and several notable themes emerged. So the first theme is that NDErs benefit from receiving validation. So this includes specifically receiving a safe outlet to share thoughts and feelings. This benefit was endorsed by 31% of NDErs. Also benefiting by experiencing validation of the NDErs' experience and reactions, which was also endorsed by 31% of NDErs. And finally, there's the general validation benefit of receiving emotional support, which was endorsed by 1/4 of NDErs. One NDEr said, validation was very important to me and my understanding of what had happened to me. It gave me the courage to be open and to accept the NDE. Another NDEr wrote, about the only helpful thing was that it was determined that I was not crazy. And another experiencer said very beautifully, to be believed in a truth you know is a basic human need. So the second important theme and benefits experienced by NDErs from seeking support was insight and understanding. Almost 1/3 of experiencers reported that they benefited from receiving insight or a different perspective on difficulties they faced. 27% of NDErs said they got help in making sense of the NDE, and 12% of NDErs experienced or reported that they benefited from understanding why the NDE happened to them. So one NDEr said, "The NDE has been, I believe, hands down, the most important experience of my life, and I have no idea what to do with it." Another experiencer wrote, "I want to understand it better. Why did it happen to me when I surely was not worthy of it?" And a few people also mentioned not knowing what the experience was and how helpful it was for them to figure out the exact term and that NDEs were a real phenomenon. So one NDEr wrote, "The hardest part for me was that I didn't know what it was for months. Had to dig and try to uncover what had happened. It was a long road to figure out a name and then still to understand and process things. A single source would be great for others who have an NDE." And a third and smaller theme that emerged in the benefits to NDErs from seeking support is relationships. 12% of NDErs reported that getting support helped them improve their relationships with family and friends. And in addition, 8% reported that their getting support helped their family and friends better understand their experience and how they changed after it. So the richness of the data in our questionnaire allowed us to look at factors that are associated with seeking any kind of support. So here I will present the significant factors that we identified. In terms of demographics, we found that younger age is associated with people being more likely to seek support. So younger people at filling out the survey are more likely to seek support, suggesting that maybe it's in more recent times that people have thought they have more avenues for support. In terms of prior background before the NDE, individuals who reported having a happy childhood were less likely to seek support, which suggests some kind of protective role. Whereas people who had previously abused drugs or alcohol were more likely to seek support. In terms of NDE-related factors, individuals who had experienced deeper NDEs or had experienced stress at the time of the NDE were more likely to seek support. In terms of factors after the NDE, we found that individuals who experienced many after effects, such as changes in beliefs, habits, and practices, as well as more difficulties and problems after the NDE, were more likely to seek support. And in addition, experiencers whose relationships and physical health deteriorated after the NDE were also more likely to seek support. We also looked at factors that predict seeking individual types of helpers, and I won't go into the data today, but across the board, we saw that NDErs reporting more changes and more issues post-NDE were more likely to seek each of the individual types of helpers as well. And interestingly, specifically when looking at seeking support from mental health professionals, we saw that NDErs who had had prior psychological counseling were more likely to seek that kind of support again. And it's unclear if this is because people who have received psychological counseling before are more comfortable with it, or if they have more issues to begin with. So conversely, we also looked at factors separately that predict respondents saying that they did not need help. Many of the effects we identified are similar, but in the opposite direction. So NDErs with less deep NDEs who had fewer after effects and fewer difficulties were more likely to state that they did not need help or support. And interestingly, we also found that a positive first reaction is more likely to make to be associated with an experiencer saying they don't need help. So if the first reaction that experiencers receive matters. And in addition to specific benefits, we asked NDErs to provide a rating of the helpfulness of the totality of the support or intervention they received. Among experiencers who reported seeking any kind of support, 80% said that it was very helpful or somewhat helpful. So this is quite promising, but unfortunately, there were also NDErs who mentioned that seeking support turned out to be harmful. And we want to know more about this group, but in our study, the sample is so small that it's really hard to draw conclusions. And the last piece of data from the NDErs that I want to show you is on factors that predict whether support sought out was helpful and beneficial. So previously we saw that NDErs who self-reported having a happy childhood were less likely to seek support, but we're also seeing that they were also more likely to report that the support they received was helpful. And experiencers who were older were more likely, older at the time of the NDE, were more likely to find the support they received helpful. In terms of post-NDE factors, speaking about the NDE in a public setting, which would include groups of NDErs or venues such as TV, radio, podcasts, or even writing a book, was associated with higher perceived helpfulness of support. And again, we found that the reaction of the first person told about the NDE matters. NDErs who experienced a positive reaction of the first person they told about the NDE were more likely to find any support they received helpful. And specifically in terms of support, we found that more types of support does not predict helpfulness. And specifically support from organizations or an online group are associated with perceptions of helpfulness, which suggests that perhaps it's the ability to share with other experiencers that has a beneficial effect. So I'd like to summarize a few key points from the NDER survey. So overall, most experiencers who get some kind of support in processing their NDE find it helpful and beneficial. There may not be a one-size-fits-all solution or way to support all NDErs in terms of specific therapy or modality. Different people had different challenges and benefited from different things, including therapy, talking to other experiencers, or even working with a shaman. But no matter the type of support, it's very important that they receive validation of their experience and how it changed them. Also some kind of normalization and maybe support in figuring out what the NDE means to the particular individual. But it's also clear that there's still a lot of room for growth in terms of avenues to help NDErs. So in the remaining time, I'd like to present some data from the other arm of the study with counselors who have worked with NDErs in addressing their therapeutic needs. So we recruited counselors through several organizations, including ASSIST, the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences, the Spiritual Emergence Network, and INs. Our definition of counselor was very broad here. So we included mental health professionals, therapists, social workers, psychiatrists, psychologists, also health professionals, nurses, and non-psychiatrist physicians. We also included chaplains and any other type of counselor who may have worked with NDErs. Counselors participated in the study by filling out an online questionnaire, which was much shorter than the questionnaire we gave to NDErs. We asked questions about their background, including religious background and whether they've had an NDE or spiritual or a similar spiritual experience. We asked about their education, about their professional specialty and the setting in which they provide support. We asked about their specific experience with NDErs, and we asked about any specific training they may have had to support NDErs, And finally, we also asked them about any difficulties that led NDErs to seek help, any benefits from seeking help, and also, again, reasons not to seek support. So these last few categories were identical to questions that we asked of NDErs, so we could look at a side-by-side comparison between the two samples. It took us more than 2 years to collect enough data from counselors. In the end, our final sample consisted of 30 counselors, which in part highlights the scarcity of professionals who provide support to NDErs. Most respondents had a graduate degree, and the median career length for counselors was 21.5 years. And specifically when working with NDErs, it was 10.5 years. And 67% of counselors identified as mental health professionals, and 37% identified as spiritual counselors. We actually allow respondents to select more than one category. And 80% of counselors provided individual psychotherapy or other type of counseling. So one of the most interesting and consequential findings from the counselors survey was that most of them, 87%, had had an NDE or comparable spiritual experience, and half of them identified as spiritual but not religious, and 67% said that their religion does not influence their work with NDErs. So let's look at direct comparisons of questions that we asked of both NDErs and counselors who have worked with NDErs. So first, what difficulties or problems may lead experiencers to seek support? Across the board, counselors endorsed each category of issues at a higher rate than NDErs. This could be due to the fact that 46% of NDErs reported none of these issues, and some of them did not need any support, whereas counselors are more likely to encounter NDErs who are seeking help with various difficulties. So in both samples, the most commonly endorsed category of difficulties was some after effect of the NDE. And similar to NDErs, counselors reported in that category that NDErs may struggle with unusual abilities like seeing the dead or knowing the future or interfering with electronics, and also having increased sensory sensitivity. And counselors also spoke of extreme changes in worldviews, as well as some symptoms of depression and anxiety. So very similar to the responses that NDErs gave. Next, let's look at the reported benefits of seeking support from various sources. So in terms of validation, there was a threefold difference between how often validation benefits were endorsed by NDErs compared to counselors who have worked with NDErs. So this could be due to NDErs having experience with non-specialized support, some of which may have been inadequate or even harmful, compared to NDE counselors who have interest and specific expertise with NDEs. So, and of course, it's also possible that NDE counselors may be overestimating the benefit of the support they provide. In terms of insight and understanding as benefits from seeking support, counselors again endorsed each benefit at a higher rate than NDErs. And we observe the same pattern for benefits for relationships as well, where counselors endorse these benefits at a higher rate than NDErs. And for both groups, benefits from relationships, for two relationships, were mentioned less often than the benefits of validation and insight into the NDE. And when asking counselors why NDErs may not seek support, they gave the highest weight to psychological reasons such as fear of being thought crazy and fear of not being believed or being ridiculed. So among the NDErs who sought some kind of support, 80% found it helpful or somewhat helpful. And among counselors, every single one of them 100% said that the interventions, therapy, and support for NDErs in general are very helpful or somewhat helpful. As with previous comparisons between the two samples, it's possible that NDErs may have come across professionals or providers who are not experienced or knowledgeable about NDEs, unlike the counselors in our study who have relevant interests and expertise. And here I'd like to summarize a few key points from the counselor data. So overall, we found that counselors echoed what NDErs reported in terms of issues, benefits, and reasons not to seek support. So this is very reassuring because it suggests these professionals are in tune with the needs of NDErs. Many counselors also reported that the NDE came up sometimes in a context in which a person was seeking help for something else, and the counselor just felt compelled to ask about the NDE. So this suggests it's important to provide this opportunity for disclosure. And the last point I want to make here is that one important difference between the mental health professionals that NDErs might have encountered and the NDE counselors in our study is that a lot of the NDE counselors have had a near-death experience or another spiritually transformative experience. And that, coupled with our other finding that NDErs greatly benefit from being able to share with other NDErs, is very powerful. So perhaps we should be encouraging NDErs who have the relevant training and inclination to provide professional support to NDErs. And finally, I'd like to end with some quotes from NDErs. One NDEr wrote, "There really are no therapies or support out there if we're being honest. There are a fraction of people who ever have this experience. This is not like other phenomena like addiction, abuse, PTSD with a wide patient population. For this reason, I don't know that there will ever be a big network for this." And another NDEr wrote, "My NDE was considerable. I know I'll never be the same person ever. So ongoing reflection and inner work is needed daily." So to me, this suggests that despite the challenges, NDErs as a group are quite resilient and dedicated. And the last quote I'd like to share is probably my favorite quote from NDEr so far. "This is hard work. It is not for wimps." So with that, I'd like to end and thank you for your attention today. And I also, again, want to express gratitude to anyone who may have participated in the study as either an NDEr or counselor, and this research would not have been possible without your contribution. Thank you. And here's my email if anyone wants to contact me with questions after the Q&A. Thank you.